hereby call to order the Roseville City Council meeting for Monday, August 7th, 2023. Mr. City Manager, would you call the roll, please?
Councilmember Etten. Councilmember Schroeder.
Here.
Councilmember Groff.
Here.
Councilmember Strawn. Mayor Rowe.
Here. And Councilmembers Etten and Strawn indicated prior to this evening that they would not be able to be here. We do have a quorum, however, so we can conduct business. We have with us at the dais our City Attorney, Christina Cruz-Jennings, who's filling in for Rachel Tierney, who's normally here, and then also our City Manager, Pat Trudgeon, on the other end of the dais. We have other staff members and guests who will participate as needed as the meeting progresses and will be introduced at that time. I want to remind people in the audience, if you have a cell phone, to be sure to silence it or otherwise assure that it doesn't disrupt the meeting. I don't believe we have any online participants this evening, so we don't have to go through the procedures related to that. So with that, we'll go ahead and ask folks to stand, if you're able, for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Right, next on our agenda tonight is approval of tonight's agenda, and as always, we'll check first with staff. Mr. Trudgeon, are there any changes that need to be made from a staff perspective this evening?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to request 10B removed. We have to approve one less license, and I'll explain it when we get there, but move 10B.
10B as in boy?
10B as in boy, yes.
Okay, so that will be considered separately, is what you're saying?
That's correct.
Yeah, okay, not removed entirely.
I'm sorry, yes, removed from the consent agenda for
Got it, okay.
taking it up.
All right, so that goes under items removed, 10B. Any other changes from staff or council this evening related to the agenda? All right, I don't believe we have any members of the public here for items on the consent agenda. I believe the only member of the public we have this evening is related to a business item, and so I don't believe there'll be any requests from members of the public to remove items from the consent agenda for separate consideration. On that presumption, we'll then ask for a motion to approve the agenda with the change to item 10B being considered separately from the consent agenda.
So moved.
Second.
All right, it's been moved by Councilmember Schroeder, seconded by Councilmember Groff. Any discussion on that motion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That passes unanimously 3-0, and we have our agenda for this evening. That then brings us to public comment. This is an opportunity for members of the public to speak on items that are not on this evening's agenda, but may be either of interest to people in the city or related to city business. Normally we do provide an opportunity for members of the public to speak during agenda items, but we also do want to specifically at the beginning of each meeting provide an opportunity for members of the public to speak on non-agenda items, as I said, that may either be of interest to people in the city or related to city business. I don't believe we have any members of the public to speak this evening, so I believe we can move on with our agenda then. We don't have any recognitions or donations this evening, so next would be items removed from consent, and we did have item 10B, which was removed for separate consideration due to a change, and I'll turn it back over to Mr. Trudgeon to introduce this item for us.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As I mentioned, I wanted to remove 10B for separate consideration. In the case, you'll note that there is one temporary gambling permit and two temporary liquor licenses. After some mix-up, it was found out that the temporary gambling permit to the American Legion Auxiliary was granted at the last meeting. Did not need to be on tonight's agenda here. So I would ask the action would be just to improve the two temporary liquor licenses, one for St. Roseville Church and the other one for Friends of Roseville Parks. And then there's no need to approve the temporary gambling permit. So if we could have a motion to that effect, I would appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Mr. Trudgeon. Are there any questions for staff, since we do have this for separate consideration? All right, probably no members of the public here to speak on this item this evening. So with that, is there a motion related to item 10B, noting we do not have to take action on the Rosetown American Legion application?
So moved.
Second.
All right, it's been moved by Councilmember Groff, seconded by Councilmember Schroeder, to approve the two remaining license applications, which is the St. Rose and the Friends of Roseville Parks. Discussion on the motion?
No.
No discussion. Hearing none. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
With that, then, we'll move on with our regular business items, and our first item this evening is to hold a public hearing to consider a liquor license for the entity known as Smash Park. They have applied for, I believe, on-sale intoxicating liquor and Sunday license, as well as the outdoor endorsement, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Trudgeon to make sure I'm right about that and provide any additional information.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You took the words right out of my mouth here. We are here to hold a public hearing for consider approving a liquor license for Smash Park. This will be on sale intoxicating liquor with Sunday sales as well as an outdoor endorsement. They have supplied all the information necessary for it and are eligible for approval of this, but as noted, we need to do a public hearing first. But note there's a representative of Smash Park in the audience if you have any questions at all. It is a use that we get a lot of questions about, and it's going to be open in the fall, so we're very excited for that, and this is one part of their business plan as well. So with that, I'll pause and be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Trudgeon. Are there any questions from the council for staff on this particular application?
No.
Any questions for the applicant? None? All right. We'll go ahead and open the public hearing. This is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to this requested liquor license application and outdoor sales endorsement. Is there anyone from the public who wishes to speak to this evening? Seeing no one, we'll go ahead and close the public hearing and then move to council consideration. We've got the request before us. Is there a motion to either approve or deny the requested license?
I move to approve.
Second.
All right, it's been moved by Councilmember Schroeder, seconded by Councilmember Groff to approve the requested license, including the outdoor endorsement, if I'm correct.
Yes,
All
that's
right.
correct.
With that, is there discussion on the motion? Maker of the motion, Councilmember Schroeder.
No, they have everything in line, so it makes sense to approve it.
All right, any discussion by the seconder, Councilmember Groff?
People are looking forward to having it in Roseville, and I think it'll be interesting to see how it develops.
All right. With that, then, we've got the motion before us to approve that license and endorsement as applied for. If there's no further discussion, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That passes unanimously 3-0. That license is approved, and we wish you the best. And I know anything we can do to get people satisfied that you're open and in business is what we want to do here, because we hear a lot from people who are interested in what you have to do. So wish you the best, and look forward to that grand opening when it happens.
Terrific. We will certainly be in touch with the city offices here for our grand opening, and we are very excited to be a part of the Roseville business community.
All right. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And just for folks at home who might not have heard that, Smash Park indicated they would be open next week, and no, but stay tuned for more information.
Absolutely.
Just wanted to see if folks were paying attention.
Thank you.
All right, you bet. Next on our agenda, we've got a couple of items related to the recent state statute updates concerning cannabis and various related products. Our first item is to consider an ordinance amending Chapter 5 of the City Code to update references to marijuana and prohibit the use of cannabis and hemp products in public places. And I'll turn it over to City Manager Trudgeon to introduce this item as well.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As you mentioned, the legislature recently passed a law that allowed the use of marijuana, possession of marijuana, the sale of marijuana, all those types of things here. And the council did receive a presentation last council meeting about the law and how it impacts cities. And we're here specifically tonight to consider an ordinance amendment that would prohibit the use of cannabis and hemp in public places as defined in the ordinance. There's also some cleanup in Chapter 5 where we have some references to marijuana that we need to take out due to the law change here. But the meat of it is really the change about consumption in public. The current state law is silent on where if it can be used in public, and it's up to local control as far as what is allowed and isn't. So in your packet is an ordinance that would sorry, let me get there, that would define what a public place is. And I would note, talking to the city attorney today, that it is drafted very broadly. And so we may want to have discussions on what we want that to apply. I think when we automatically think of public places, we think of parks and maybe sidewalks. But there's other places that are public, open to the public, that might be private businesses that would also potentially be impacted with that. So as I mentioned in the ordinance, if you look at your packet, the first couple pages are just taking out some wording that was been in our code for many, many years, but no longer need to be in there because of the law change. And it's really on the, I think it's the fourth page, and I can pull it up on the screen here as well, where we get into the prohibition of use in public, where we define what we're talking about and the public place, and then ultimately say that's not, cannabis cannot be used in public places as defined in the ordinance. I'll defer to the city attorney if there's any other further clarification she may want to make, or we can get right into the questions, as I know there are some.
I don't have any clarifications, but I'm here to answer any questions or participate in any discussion.
Great, thank you. Are there questions from the council on the proposed ordinance change? Councilmember Schroeder.
I guess a couple of questions. I'm looking at where you changed some of the wording, specifically around line 105. It seems like all the other letters up to that point, it talked about controlled substance. And on this one, it says cocaine into the human body. Shouldn't that say controlled substances as well, and not just specifically cocaine?
Which may be a little broader than the marijuana and hemp products discussion, but a good
Right,
question.
but you know, he's changing, he took out hashish in this paragraph, and
Right.
so then,
Because I think that falls under the
Yeah,
the
right.
general, I think that falls under the general
Right, and so-
hemp-based products or
Yep.
cannabis products.
but again, all the other ones above it say controlled substance, and H and I and J all say, they're talking about control, and here we're only talking about the cocaine one. So that's where, I mean, if we're changing it, let's do it correctly.
I would think that's probably something that we could look at changing. I think it's referred to elsewhere, so it's a good catch.
Yep, on that.
Does that seem consistent from the attorney's point of view as well?
Yes, and I actually looked at this earlier and thought the same thing, that some of these materials that it discusses, I think, can be used.
That's what I was gonna bring up next, was there's a number of these other items, crossed out a number of items, but there's a few in there that you can use with marijuana as well, like water pipes, and some of these I don't know, but, you know, smoking and things. So my question is, if these items listed can be used for both controlled substances and marijuana, how do we deal with that? So-
Yeah, so I know Attorney Tierney did some research and as much as she could to see, you know, how some of these devices are used. And yeah, I think she mentioned that some of them can be used to smoke other drugs. So I think it's a good catch, and I think it makes sense to make this a little bit of a broader category.
Okay. So would that be accomplished simply by substituting essentially controlled substances for the word cocaine in the first paragraph, K, which then everything else below it refers up back to, I guess?
I believe so, yes.
Okay,
Okay, that's what I had.
right. Any other questions for staff or the attorney?
The only other, it's not so much a specific question as a concern of why the law went into effect in the first place was because there's a history of the BIPOC community being, this has been used to discriminate against people. And so my concern is that would this be adding that back into the equation? And I have full confidence in our police force, and I know where we are with that as far as not penalizing poor people. Typically what we talk about is the headlights issue or the tail light issue where we don't keep piling on fines, but this is the only concern I have in this change. And I don't know if we can address that tonight or work on that.
Mr. Judge?
I was going to say it's a very good point, something that we should be cognizant of. I think absent having anything in the code, it's very hard to stop people or educate people that they cannot smoke in a park or use it. So obviously every case is going to be different depending on the circumstances, but I think the approach would be more of an education. Hey, we don't allow it in our parks. You're going to have to go to somewhere else where you can smoke it legally or use the products legally, and would not necessarily be used as a hammer, but it's something that we can rely on. As our law enforcement interacts with people, let them know it's against the law to do that. Please, move along. I think for many years, marijuana enforcement has been very limited because of other more pressing priorities. It's more of an education and please move along than versus a fine and an arrest. But it certainly could happen, so I think it's good to be aware of it and bring it up, and we can continue to have conversations about what our formal policy would be. But having this on the books does allow us to have that interaction to make sure that things aren't happening in parks, whether it's in front of children or other things, that we can then have them move along and,
Yeah.
not be in the park, for
And
instance.
that's totally understandable, because obviously if they're out for a family picnic, you don't really want smoke wafting over to your picnic blanket.
So, and that kind of brings me to the topic, a series of questions that I had for Mr. Trudgeon when I talked with him earlier today, and it relates to sort of the equity in the sense of how do we handle other controlled substances in public spaces in the city of Roseville, and maybe more broadly in the state of Minnesota. And through a little bit of research, and I'll depend on the attorney to correct me if I'm wrong about this, but one of the things, first of all, and I had asked about this at our last discussion about it when we had the presentation from Ms. Tierney about the new law, it was things like, public intoxication, and actually Minnesota is one of a few states that actually has a law that says public intoxication is not a crime in the state of Minnesota. So that sort of preempts anybody from being able to put something on the books to say it is a crime, public intoxication itself. Then Minnesota also has the open container law,
Right.
which relates and is fairly specific about, especially in vehicles, driver and passenger and responsibility of owners, even if they're not present, and things like that. Very prudent, I think. And then the only other thing I could find in state statutes seemed to be that the state also prohibits consumption of alcohol in state parks and perhaps other spaces like that in the state. And then it seems like it's up to sort of individual jurisdictions to talk about more restrictions about consumption on the alcohol side. And I would note in Roseville specifically, the only prohibition we seem to have on the consumption of alcohol is in our parks, and that's in actually Chapter 7, which is the bench handout that Mr. Trudgeon had available for us tonight, because I had asked that. Because, as was noted in the initial presentation, as this law is drafted, it is extremely broad. It's defining public space as essentially any space that isn't otherwise a private space. And we're prohibiting the use of cannabis products as well as lower potency hemp edibles and hemp-derived consumer products, which may or may not be a nuisance, if you will, in their use to members of the public. And so I'm very concerned about the things that are covered by it, the places that are covered by it, and the equity, so to speak, with alcohol consumption and use in public spaces. And then getting at smoking, too, we actually, I don't believe, prohibit smoking in our parks, just generally smoking. And
Not by ordinance.
I've had to look in that ordinance again, but I don't
No,
think it was.
not by ordinance, you're correct.
And partly because that's an outdoor space. So then if, we're concerned about people smoking these products, but we're not, talking about smoking cigarettes, which can be just as disturbing to people and potentially have health impacts to people, perhaps we may want to think about that equity amongst different types of uses and make sure that I think, the unintended consequence of this broad and, drafting is exactly what you're saying, Councilmember Groff, but also just more broadly that we are being more restrictive with these products, even what some might consider fairly mild products, such as the hemp-derived and edibles and things like that. And so that's what gave me pause here, and I wanted to make sure that we had a conversation as the council as to how we wanted to look at that. We may want to decide to restrict smoking in our city parks, and that covers any kind of smoking. We may only want to limit it to these products, and then do we do that in the Chapter 7, or Title 7, Chapter 701, that talks about other things you can't do in parks, if we're specifically talking about parks, or do we want to do something more broadly across other public spaces? And then the question is, how do we want to address, alcohol use, and is there a difference between some of these edible products or those types of things, and then, the actual like smoking and vaping and things like that? So that's a long soliloquy there, but I wanted to get the question out there for the council to think about and provide some feedback so that we can maybe provide some direction to staff in that regard. And it's a little unfortunate we don't have the full council here this evening in that regard, but like I said, I wanted to make sure to ask the questions and have the chance for people to think about it. So I don't know if off the top of your heads you have thoughts at this point, but perhaps we have some further questions or follow-up we want to even direct back to staff before we take this up.
Do we have the statute? It says here, when you're talking about the terms, it says it's the definitions given to them in Minnesota statute, section 342.01.
So that is the new cannabis law. I
And
believe.
so, but that's what we're using to define.
Correct.
So wouldn't it make sense then that we're in line with what they have written?
Well, yes, I think the question is, how do we want to regulate those products? I mean, that's one thing to define them the same way. You definitely want to be
Yeah.
consistent with state statute.
So I
But
just
then-
wanted to verify
right,
that we're okay with that.
If we're okay with the regulation, we would want to define them
Right,
properly.
right, yeah,
yes,
yeah,
yes.
okay.
We pretty much have to.
Right, exactly.
I think consistency is another thing, and I think that ties into what you're talking about, Mayor, consistency in what we're doing here. So, the smoking thing is tricky because obviously, I don't smoke, and so I have my own views on that. But I also understand some people do smoke, and it is a legal thing. So you don't want to make it so impossible for people that if they're somewhere they can't go and have a cigarette somewhere. I don't know how we quite manage that and make it workable.
Well, and definitely, it's probably able to be said that smoking, marijuana products is both creating smoke that can be an irritant and annoyance to people, which smoking itself of tobacco products does.
True, yeah.
But it is also a controlled substance in the sense that it does do some of the same things or similar things to what alcohol does. And we do not allow use of alcohol in our parks specifically. So it could be said that that would be consistent, at least in the point of view of it being a substance that can create, impacts to people's or impair people's abilities or whatever you want to say, similar to alcohol. And if the purpose of not permitting alcohol in our parks is to sort of prevent issues related to that, it could be sensible to say that use of these products, at least especially higher potency products, and I don't know if we want to draw the line on some of the lower potency products that may even be harder to know whether people are using in the first place. I can see where we might be able to put some distinction there and put that into our code. But, and then there's just that whole question of, do we just talk about our parks specifically, or do we talk about more broadly other spaces? But then I would kind of turn the question back around and say, well, what are we doing with respect to consumption of alcohol in these other places? So
Yeah.
it gets to be a question.
Yeah.
It seems that where I'm having trouble with the lower potency hemp derived consumer products, I mean, you have things like salve and, just some things, and so what are we putting in there? So if somebody, you know what I mean? So I'm wondering if you can lump it all together. It'd be cleaner, but I don't know.
It just would be terribly difficult to enforce something like that. It would be like going through somebody's purse or something. I just-
Well, which creates a whole other host of
Yeah.
Fourth Amendment issues, I believe.
Yeah.
But, so is there a sense from council members this evening that we're sort of okay with the broad prohibition and specific to these products? Do we want to look at something more specific to parks and or potentially other public spaces more in the public realm, like city-owned, in other words? And then talk about the different types of products and how to treat those, or do we just maybe need to kind of table this for further discussion with the whole council and potentially more information maybe from staff and attorneys if there are specific questions about, for instance, sort of these edibles and what their potency is relative to other products that we might think of, like alcohol and 3-2 beer versus strong beer, those types of things.
I'm sort of leaning that way myself, but I just think that this is a broad enough subject and this is information that, it won't hurt to delay it a little bit here. And I think having the full council, at least one more person here would be better. I would like the conversation better that way.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, more information the better. Excuse me.
Yeah. The other thing I would note is we could conceivably take action on the ordinance, the first part,
Yeah.
and strike out the second part if we
Okay.
wanted to at least change,
Yeah.
our regulations
Yes.
that are outdated by the
Right.
new law. And then noting the change, substituting controlled substance for cocaine on line 107.
Yeah.
I think
So that might be possible. Mr. Trudge?
It certainly is. I would suggest maybe to keep it easier, just kind of keep it all together as a package. The state law speaks to it already in some respects, but versus having multiple ordinances, I think it's just fine. There's no urgency as far as I can see on that. If I could, though, just to probe a little bit, is there desire of the council members here to consider a more narrow perspective, just really focused on parks or public land owned by the city, where this prohibition would take place? Still need to have the discussion on what products we're talking about. I understand that. And then another follow-up, is there any desire to bring forward something banning smoking of tobacco products in city parks?
I
Councilor.
would probably lean towards just the public parks and that. I just don't see us banning it, all these things. Like, you see people standing outside of a building smoking on the sidewalk. I think that would be really difficult for us to enforce that.
It would be,
And
yes.
kind of unreasonable for something that isn't still a legal product.
And I think individual businesses can certainly enforce their own requirements inside
Yes.
their premises, and I know a lot of businesses, prohibit smoking within a certain distance of doorways, which I think the Clean Indoor Air Act allows businesses to do. So perhaps that is the best system related to the smoking side of it. And I don't think we want to go down the road of looking at prohibiting smoking in our parks, just generally.
Tobacco.
Tobacco, or anything, right, I think, a broad prohibition of smoking. I think that, once again, there seems to be a distinction in terms of the effects of the cannabis products and smoking that we might be able to look at being consistent with alcohol in parks.
Sure. Focus on that part of.
Sure,
Of
in that part
that's
of it. But I don't get a sense, unless, Councilmember Short,
Well,
you think we
yeah.
want a more broad?
No, that makes sense, because really, the high potency cannabis one, it's like, drinking and driving. So when people, taking a high potency cannabis and then getting in their car in a park and driving off. So, that's where you talk about it's closer to the alcohol side of things versus the cigarette side of things.
Although they are quite different. They'll probably just lay on the blanket and sleep.
Well, the effects are perhaps different, but they did specifically in the state law prohibit driving
Right.
under the
And
influence
that's
of
my
cannabis,
point.
yeah. And I guess I'm not sure on the quote-unquote potency of some of the low potency items as to whether those are also included in terms of if you're under the influence of those, or do you just have to consume so much
I don't know.
that, I think we would need some kind of expert information on that as to even understand that, and I don't know if you're prepared to answer.
I can speak to, so I was in public defense before I went to Kennedy and Graven, so a little bit. They don't have a specific standard for what intoxication looks like for marijuana. It can be any amount. And so I think that's something that the state's gonna have to grapple with as they figure that out. And then the other thing I just wanted to make sure was understood is lower potency hemp edibles is anything that has, I think it's less than 3% THC. And then the
Is it 3% or 0.3%?
3, was it 0.3?
0.3, yes.
0.3%.
.3%.
Okay.
Yeah, and then the beverages either have 5 or 10 milligrams of THC.
Okay.
So then those are all classified as the lower
Fairly
potency.
small, low potency amounts.
Yeah.
Okay. And I just don't know if the state law is treating those any differently in terms of, other than how the sale is regulated and things like that.
So the only other thing the state law has that I can think of off the top of my head is they have a prohibition on vaporizing or smoking cannabis flower or cannabis products or hemp-derived consumer products in a location where they may be inhaled by a minor. But I'll note that there's no enforcement mechanism for that. And I'm sure that Attorney Tierney mentioned that in her presentation.
Okay.
Actually, that's a good point,
Yeah.
when we're looking at this, because, to keep it away from anyone who's under 21. So, so make sure, how we look at this, considering that as our premise.
Okay.
So, I think, and that brings us to the point that it probably won't be in chapter, or Title 5 anymore in terms of that. If it's specific to parks, it would be in that,
Right.
that section of Title 7.
Well, yeah, I think I would want to talk to the attorney on that. This is the general penalties section, so but I understand your point as well. I don't know how those mesh, I should say. So we can talk about that and this is what the best approach is
All right.
on that. But thank you for the input. I think we can start looking at some language to narrow it to parks and city-owned property, and then have the conversation go from there when the rest of the council's here.
Sure, Councilman.
Have we had any input from the police department on this?
Beyond this general
Prepared to provide any input?
beyond general conversation, no, not much, not a focused
Because
conversation.
I do want to make it so that it's something they can, I don't want to make it an unreasonable thing to enforce.
Certainly.
Do we have any examples of what other cities have written or done?
I think everybody's doing the same thing we're doing right now, scrambling.
So I was just, who's
Yeah.
first, right?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
That's what I was hoping.
And I know Kennedy Graven represents a lot of cities, so I think collectively they've been working with a lot of different cities as a group on trying to come up with the best language. So once again, we can go back to city attorney and, kind of keep refining and seeing what best practices are. And as always, with something new, you try something and then you learn as you go on that you need to make some more tweaks. And I think we're all open to doing that down the road.
Like revisit in any year?
Yep.
And definitely, just from the alcohol enforcement point of view, there are a variety of different levels of regulation of consumption in public places across different cities and jurisdictions. I was looking at Minneapolis, and they've got a lot of restrictions on public consumption. And perhaps that has been done as an effort to get at problems with the consequences of intoxication.
Yes.
Since public intoxication itself isn't necessarily, isn't a crime. I think that's probably been a way to try to hopefully curb, having to deal with then some of those subsequent consequences. But I don't know in our history in Roseville if we've had a lot of issues with public consumption, just in the general public areas outside of parks and other city properties. So, yeah, all right. Do you feel like staff has got good guidance then?
Yep, that's helpful. Yep.
Great, thanks.
working on it.
Good discussion. Next on our agenda then, so that'll be coming back for further discussion then
Absolutely.
and an updated draft. Next on our agenda then, we have consideration of possible changes to City Code Chapter 316. This relates to the city's regulation of the sale of THC products. And I'll turn it back over to Mr. Trudgeon to introduce this one.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As you mentioned, we want to talk a little bit more specifically about THC products, which is a subset of cannabis products. And as you know, last year the legislature passed a law allowing or legalizing, I should say, the sale and use of THC edibles up to a certain limit, as well as beverages. And like most cities, we struggled with that at first, put a moratorium in place. And since last fall, I've had a regulatory framework where we do have THC licenses. Among the other things that chapter does is we do only allow up to 8 licenses for THC products and limit those to age-restricted establishments, meaning they can only allow people 21 and over. So with the new law change, one of the wrinkles is something that was prohibited before. Exclusive liquor stores, so think liquor stores, were prohibited under the previous law, but now are able to sell THC products, edibles and or beverages. So that automatically opens up the ability for more businesses, and they would technically fit our age-restricted definition, 21 and over. Currently, we're at the maximum of our licenses at 8. I would note 2 of them are liquor stores. Knowing that there's more liquor stores that either are selling or would like to sell, we have not done a survey or gone out to each store, that cap is probably too low given what we know is out there. In addition, I've noticed as I've gone out to restaurants, you see THC beverages on the menu more and more. And there are probably a lot of restaurants here in Roseville that would like to sell THC products. Once again, we haven't been around to every single restaurant to determine what's happening, but we also would have some upward pressure, I think, on that as THC products become more and more accepted. So really bringing this forward for a discussion, not a decision tonight, about looking at a couple things that are currently in the ordinance we may want to consider. One, our city code, I have this up on the screen here, specifically prohibits exclusive liquor stores from receiving a THC license. Obviously, that's now allowed, so we would need to strike that. It's pretty straightforward. Then some conversation about removing or adjusting the cap on the THC licenses. As I mentioned, we have 8 some options, and there's more than what I have listed, I'm sure, but want to just remove the cap completely, but still require all businesses that are selling THC products to get a license to the city, administrative license. I would pause there for a second. I would note that at some point in the future, the state will take over the licensing of everything, including THC products, and then we can register them at some point, but we don't know when that date is. So we're kind of talking about the next 6 months, year and a half. I don't know how we want to approach it. So just kind of keep that in mind. So that's one thing we can just remove the cap completely and just have them come on in and get their licenses if they want to sell it. We could still consider a cap of a number 8 as we have now, or maybe a different number, but really say that holders of liquor licenses under 340A, so that includes liquor stores, but also on sale places like a restaurant, that that cap would not be applied to those uses, but they would still need to get a license. So we try to limit the pure retailers, I guess is the way to look at it, whether it's tobacco stores or a hemp store. Limit that to a certain number, but for liquor stores and restaurants, don't really apply a cap to that, knowing that that's going to fluctuate over time as restaurants come and go. So that's a couple options to consider there, and as I said, there's maybe some other thoughts there as well. And I have some suggested language there, and that's just a first run at it. Then the other thing that's a little tricky is age-restricted establishments. So when we limited it to age-restricted, we were thinking of age-restricted tobacco stores and other places that would prohibit people under 21 going. As you know, most restaurants do not prohibit people under 21. There are liquor sales, maybe there's a separate section where persons under 21 can't sit, but certainly in the dining area, there's people consuming alcohol. So that's going to be a little bit tricky. So I think we do need to do something with that, either just remove it outright completely and not be concerned about that, or have some language, and I just once again have some suggested language here, that it is still restricted. This is the bottom of the screen there. That is still restricted to age-restricted places unless the person, which is the wording that they use, but the liquor license has a liquor license as established under Chapter 340A and issued by the city. So once again, meaning restaurants and liquor stores. Liquor stores, you can't go in there, but restaurants it wouldn't apply to. But everybody else that would have a license would need to do that. So there's several layers here, but just kind of laying out options. We're just looking for some feedback. As I said, there's probably other ways to approach it, but just want to tee it up for conversation and see where we want to go. As I said, eventually, some of this detail will need to go away because we will not be directly licensing these products, but for the time being, we have to come up with something. And we do get inquiries a couple times a week from places that want to, mostly restaurants, that want to sell THC products, and we say we can't right now. I once again, if we were to go out and survey the restaurants, I do wonder what's happening out there. So I think we also have to face reality a little bit, and not saying we wouldn't, but that's just happening out there. It's happening so quickly that having some sort of resolution on this would be helpful for staff as we go out and try to enforce it.
Great, thank you. I do have just a follow-up on the 2 liquor stores that have current city THC licenses. Did they get those after the new state law went into effect? So they weren't in violation of our own
No.
prohibition prior to that? Okay.
Well, yeah, but that's a really good question because, no, it happened after the law changed where it's permitted, but technically our ordinance still says you can't.
And they came through here, I think we actually.
Yeah, no, the city council approved it.
But under the state law, they would be permitted anyway.
Yeah.
So despite our ordinance being
Right.
in
Yeah,
contradiction
yeah.
with that, my
Yeah.
understanding is that we
Yeah.
can't be in contradiction of state law.
That's
generally
correct,
speaking.
correct, yeah.
All right. Okay, lots to think about here. Thoughts from the council or questions? Councilmember Schroeder?
Actually, I do like, first obviously to remove to prohibit liquor stores, obviously we have to do that one, that's a no-brainer. But when it comes to the cap piece, I liked your second option where you kept the cap of 8, but then if you have a liquor license, which includes the restaurants, that then they could do that. And part of the reason I like that is I think there will be some new restrictions on how many can be in a county and in cities and things later on. And I think I'd be more comfortable trying to keep it at 8 until the state gets some of that figured out versus if all of a sudden you end up with 50 in Roseville and then the state comes up with their requirements of how many you can and cannot, allow, because they were talking about limiting it to the population in a county. So in a way, I'd like to make sure we don't get too many that are here and then have something come later that we may not be able to incorporate. So I kind of like that number 2 option where you would, it broadens it up more for the restaurants.
And if I could add, I think it's probably logical to assume that if they're selling THC products, eventually they'll look to sell cannabis as well.
Right, right.
So to your point, if we have a lot of them, we may have to try to claw some of that back. I would also note that, and the attorney can correct me, but we can have we can have a cap based on our population, but we don't need to have a cap. We can allow as many as we want, but that's for the council to decide what we're comfortable with. But
Right.
So yeah, the way the state law is written, as I understand it, is it just says that you can't set a cap lower than
yeah,
Right.
that's
the number per population unless the countywide,
Right.
that there is a countywide limit, and then second out, that it's already,
And I'd like to wait till we see some more of that.
right.
Because we don't want to be the municipality in the county that ends up with all.
Yes,
40 of them.
exactly.
No, I think that makes sense. I tend to lean towards number 2 as
Yeah.
well. And then in terms of the notion of the restricted entry to people over 21, I think that language is actually pretty good too.
Yeah.
That if you have the liquor license of any category from the city, you're not subject to that. Restaurants aren't anyway, and then to the extent liquor stores already are, they are. So, that covers that. But then those other 8 have that restriction still, which I think
Yes.
makes sense.
Yeah. Right.
And technically then, so a Bloom Brauhaus as well as the 2 liquor stores would come out, so we'd be down to 5 at that
Correct.
point of our 8. And so conceivably, we're limited to 4 tobacco shops by our tobacco ordinance.
that's correct.
So that will allow for 3 more potential entrepreneurial efforts that want to do it that aren't liquor license holders and aren't smoke shops then. So I think that gives us some room. Yeah. All right.
And it'll probably change next year.
Well, yes, this is the sort of in-between
Yes.
period, right,
So I think that's
exactly,
a
the limbo law, yes,
A good best
yeah.
guess with the information we have available at the time.
Yes,
Yep, no,
exactly.
that makes good sense.
Well, that's great. We'll put this in more of an ordinance form and bring it back for future discussion. Obviously, some colleagues aren't here, but we'll be bringing it back in for consideration in a future meeting here and move forward.
I think the only thing that I'm not 100% clear on is whether the state, when the state gets into licensing it, will have restrictions on, along any of these lines. I'm not sure, if it's just gonna be basically anybody that wants to sell THC products can get a license, assuming they meet all the license requirements.
Well, but isn't there where the cities can put in some things like, and we need to update our.
Zoning
code.
restrictions.
Yeah, the zoning
Yep, yes,
restrictions.
yep.
Yes. So we need to work on that as well.
Yeah, to the extent that we want to do zoning restrictions,
You know,
yes,
like
we
from
have to.
schools or
Right.
daycares
Yeah.
or something like that.
Right, and that was definitely a discussion we had
Yeah.
with Ms. Tierney's
Yeah,
presentation
exactly.
last time, and so
Yep.
that's one of our follow-up items to be coming,
Yes.
yes,
Yep.
for sure. Okay.
Oh, one more
Yeah,
question.
Councilmember.
So, are we, as I read this, we are responsible for compliance checks?
Yes, we are.
until The state? does?
Forever, no.
Forever.
Yep.
So how, okay, well, we'll have to.
Well, and just on that note, there is a part of the cannabis tax, some of it will trickle
So that'll
back to
come
the
back to
city.
help us
How much,
fund
we
that.
don't know.
It is a trickle because it's a
Yeah.
small piece.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But there is some dollars,
Yep.
in theory, coming back to help pay
Yeah,
for
I
some
think
of
it's
that.
at least in some part of the formula related to that, the number of licensees you
Right.
have
Yeah.
in your city, so.
Yep.
Not that you want more licensees just
just
to get
to
more
do that,
money,
no.
but because it may or may not even cover
No,
your
it may
costs, so,
not.
yeah, exactly. All right. All right, that brings us then to item 7C, which is another consideration of potential ordinance amendments. This is on a different topic related to political signs in the city of Roseville, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Trudgeon once again for this item.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thanks to Councilmember Schroeder for bringing this topic up. So under, once again, we're talking about the legislature a lot today, but they did a lot of things. One of the things that they did was kind of create a new category of early in-person voting instead of this absentee balloting process we've been using for many years. And under the new law, early voting in-person early voting shall begin 18 days prior to the election. So currently, we regulate our political signs and when they can be put up, and there's some nuances between odd year and even year, but based on the actual election date and then backing up from then when political signs can be put up. And I think, if you think about why we would allow signs, first of all, it's a First Amendment issue, but also we want to make sure voters are informed and people are understanding what is on the ballot or not. And when absent early in-person voting, you would, years ago, had absentee balloting, but it was very hard to do. You had to have certain things happen that made you eligible for it. But now the fact that in-person voting is going to be taking place much earlier than the election, it seemed logical to use those same dates and back them up from the start of the early in-person voting versus the actual election date. So this is all that ordinance simply does. It just simply states that for even years or state general election years shall be, political signs can be 46 days before the first day of in-person voting. So the underlying section, what's being added previously, it just said before the primary election. So it just kind of corresponds better to what state law says. And the second part is for when there's no state general elections. It's a shorter period of time, but 21 days before the first day of in-person voting. When there's no primary, the same thing applies for the general election. So kind of a simple fix, but just acknowledging that we have the new early in-person voting and just trying to make sure that the signs can be put up within the time frame before people start voting.
Great, thank you, Mr. Trudgeon. Questions for council or for staff?
Just a comment.
Councilmember Schroeder.
It seems to me it was very straightforward since, the state of Minnesota changed this, that we would be in lockstep with that too. And everything that our city manager talked about makes sense, and it's a very straightforward fix, so I think it's something we need to do.
And people can decide not to put up signs.
Absolutely,
Just
it's
the
totally
earliest they can
voluntary,
do it,
right,
so.
exactly. Whether you want to accept a sign is voluntary, and whether a candidate wants to start putting up signs is voluntary, or an issue advocate. The one thing I was a little curious about, just because this topic has come up, is why the city of Roseville treats general elections elections in the state general election even year differently in the time frame than elections in the odd year. Why do people who happen to be up for election or questions that happen to be on the ballot in those even years get an extra 25 days to have their signs up? And I wasn't sure if there's something in state law that precludes cities from making it any shorter than 46 days or something like that. Just from that point of view, do we want to just change it to be consistent for all elections? And so I wanted to, since we're talking about this issue, at least put the question out there and see if there's a reason, A, that we have to treat the two types of elections differently, which seems unlikely, and B, do we want to treat them differently just from our own policy perspective? So, and I know you haven't had a chance to think about that yet, unless the same question popped into your mind as you were looking at it, but, once again, we don't necessarily even have to take action tonight if we don't want to, but I wanted to ask the question since it's before us.
Well, my question would be, when is the early voting starting this year?
I think we have that table. Pat, do you have that? Can you bring that?
I don't have it pulled up right here on the bigger screen there, but
So I think in this year's election, the date would move from September 22nd
to September 4th.
to September 4th.
So I guess I would.
That's if there's no primary, correct?
Yeah.
Right, and so
Primary
that's,
would be
I skipped the primary.
Right.
so I guess I would want to get this changed sooner than later,
Yeah.
just because
Right.
of that.
Right. Well, and I understand that. I guess the question being is why are we treating the 2 years of elections differently? Are school board elections and whatever else might be on an odd year election, I don't know, less important than general elections? Or, and once again, is there something in state law that makes it have to be 46 days? And so that's, and I don't know if our attorney can answer that. I don't want to.
I would have to look into that.
I know there are state laws about political signs.
Yeah.
I've gotten the
Yeah.
packet of information every time I run for
Right.
office. But
Take a peek
I
on
couldn't
it.
remember it off the top of my head, and I couldn't find the packet.
Yeah, and I was doing some research, and I just don't recall anything. The only thing I could see in state statutes in 211B, 045, it allows it before 46 days before the state primary in a state general election.
So maybe we were trying to be consistent with the state law with regard to those.
For those, and how we diverge to 21 days on non-state primary, state general elections, I'm not quite sure. It could be peculiar to Roseville, or it might be standard, or there might be some reference in the code, but I have not come across that.
Well, and I would say that, Roseville used to held our municipal elections in odd years as well. We didn't
Yes.
have any municipal
Right.
elections in even years. And in that case, the only signs that were up in Roseville during even years were state-related, state offices and things like that. And so I imagine that it was originally drafted to be consistent with state law with regard to state elections in A, and that's where the 46 days may have come from. And then B was created for municipal elections, and we got to do our own thing, I guess, because the state law was quiet on that. But once again, it seems like, with respect to fairness, that we may want to make it the same in every
Just
every
change
year,
that to 46.
and just make it for all elections. And I don't want this to take too long to put into effect.
Right, because, it's to be fair to the people this year.
Yeah,
I mean, it'd be relatively easy to keep 2 paragraphs and just change 21 to 46.
I'd be okay with that.
I'm fine with that.
And then if we wanted to further improve it and put it into 1 paragraph,
In the future.
yeah, we can do that later.
Okay.
The other thing that it just is a question about the quirkiness of the language here is, it appears at the end of B in the last sentence, there's a restriction on the size of the gross area of the signs, and I'm presuming that once again is because we can do it for off-year elections, whereas state law covers
It can be any size,
non-off
yeah.
years election. Okay, so we'll leave that alone, but it was kind of quirky and I had to ask the question. Right, so if we were to take this up tonight, it sounds like the consensus would be then to change the date in paragraph B, or the number of days, from 21 days in both instances to 46 days, to be consistent.
Agreed.
Is there any,
I'll make that.
well, I was gonna say, first of all, is there any reason from a staff or legal perspective that we shouldn't do that? Last thing we wanna do is make a mistake, Mr. Trudgeon.
I would have to actually go back and look at my notes, but I think the challenge is when there is, let me think this through, when there's a primary, summer primary, 46 days.
It would be the same dates as for an even year election. It would
So
still be an
then, yeah,
August
June.
primary, so
Okay,
it would be
okay.
June.
28.
Because at one point, we're looking at some combination where you could start putting up signs before the registration period even ended for filing in the first place, but,
Well, not to add complexity here, but if, in fact, the 46 days in state law is related to the election day, and we're putting a standard that's related to the
I think
start of early
that's
voting.
what it was, you put it 18 days before that.
Right.
I think that got you into end of May, early June, if I remember right, which could,
But the filing period should be the same for primaries in odd years, because the primary date is set to
yeah,
be.
yeah,
that
and there
same
are
weekend,
dates that are up
part
on
of August.
on the,
And again, they wouldn't have to put up their signs at that time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because people aren't going to.
I think if the state law is 46 days before the actual election day, conceivably, if there's 18 days of early voting prior to that, you could just continue to have your sign law be 46 days before the election day. Because that's going to be at least, a good chunk of time before the early voting starts.
And that's really the main thing, is to be able to get your signs up before early
Right.
voting starts.
So the primary in '24 would be August 13th would be the date. So you have to go 18 days before then and then count 46.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is if the state law is referring to the actual election date, why do we want to add another 18 days in front of that with the 46 days if the state law isn't requiring it in their elections? I mean, we're basically adding 18 more days beyond what the state law allows at that point, or what the state law restriction is. And I'm not sure that we need to go earlier than what state law is providing for in state elections. And so that's where I'm saying maybe we just make both of them 46 days before the date of the primary election, or the general election in odd years if there's no primary. And then I think we're covered.
Yeah, because then they'd be able to get their signs up. If there's a primary, when does
It would
voting
be,
start?
well, so the 46 days would be the election date of either the primary or the general, depending on whether there is a
Okay, so
primary.
on the primary.
So if there is a primary, it would be 46 days
Okay,
before that.
okay, I
And
see.
the early voting starts 18 days before that, so you'd have 28 days.
Okay, yeah,
Up your
so
signs.
as long as it's the primary and the
Mhm.
general, so it's not just on the general.
Right.
Can you say that again, Mr. Mayor? I'm not sure I tracked.
So, which part?
Well, the last part about the 26 days, you only have to put the signs up.
So if you look at the restriction being that you can't put up signs earlier than 46 days before the date of the election,
Which is current law now.
which is
Yeah.
current law, state law in even your elections, and that includes primaries. So if there's a primary, it's 46 days
Yep.
before the primary. If early in-person voting starts 18 days before the election day, that cuts into the 46-day period by 18 days, which means that you have your signs up potentially. You're allowed to have your signs up if you have a 46-day window from the election day. You would still have 28 days to have signs up prior to the start of the early voting.
Right.
Under that 46-day
Right.
window from the election day.
Right.
And so the question is, do we need to push it another 18 days earlier? Or is the 46-day period from the election day adequate even with the early voting starting?
Right, so it's
18
46 days before the primary, if there's a primary. If there's no primary, it's 46 days before the general election.
Right.
But this ordinance would not do that. That would.
We would have to change the language in this ordinance. What we would have to do is we'd have to strike in the A, the red language,
Yes.
and strike the red language in B as well.
Yeah.
And then change both of the 21s in B to 46.
So don't tie it to in-person early voting at all.
We're just tying it to the election date. of the
Election
state
date,
law.
so as is, but we're just actually expanding just on the odd years.
Correct.
To 46 days.
So then people can get their signs up before,
Yeah, they've got
Before
roughly
early
4
voting.
weeks prior to early voting starting if
Yeah.
we leave the 46 days from the election date.
So in a year like this, they could be putting signs up earlier than October or whatever it was in my,
Well, if
it's
this
21
year,
days.
If there happened to be a primary, it would be June.
yeah.
If there's
or-
no primary, then, which I don't think in school board elections there is a primary, so then it would be September 20, no, it would be, well, 46 days from November 7th.
Yeah,
what would that be?
Sometime in September.
Yeah, a month and a half, basically.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the whole month of October, half of September, it's probably about
Yeah.
September 20th-ish
Yeah.
Like that.
for an October election. And early voting would start October 20th. So they would have roughly about a month, once again, 28 days of signs being up prior to that October 20th date.
And so what we have now, it's 21 days.
Right, so,
it just
Instead
follows
of
the same
46.
pattern as what we've had.
right. But we're saying, we would be making it 21 days from that 18-day period, which would be effectively 39.
So much math in our heads.
Yes,
huh?
yes. It's,
So what we're talking about then is just changing both,
so we would actually allow more time if we made the changes that I suggested
46 days.
Okay.
on the odd year elections.
all right, so that makes sense. So,
So,
does that
We-
make sense, Pat?
Yeah, no, so if, I'll
Just
I'll
follow the,
yeah, so the, under A, we take out the underlined red completely, leave that alone. Then take out the underlined red in both. top and the bottom and B there, and then change 21 days to 46 days before the primary election, 46 days before the general election.
Correct.
And not tie anything to early voting, it's just.
Right, we're just saying we're covering it.
Okay.
Okay,
So,
that's easy.
so Wayne, did you want to change your,
Your not yet made motion?
your half?
Yes, I would like to change that. Are we going to do this tonight? That's the next.
It seems like we're doing it tonight.
I would make the motion that it would follow 46 days before the primary, 46 days before the general election.
Right, so to the amendment as we discussed just a moment ago.
Yeah, and I would second that.
All right. Moved by Councilmember Groff, seconded by Councilmember Schroeder to adopt the ordinance with the amendments we just discussed, removing the reference to the early absentee voting day and changing the odd year election time period to 46 days instead of 21 to be consistent.
Correct.
All right. And I presume we have an ordinance summary,
We do.
and I was going to look to see if the language of the ordinance summary, we can cross that bridge when we
that.
get to it, but,
Yeah, it does mention the 21 days in there, so.
all right. So
Yeah,
we have to
it has to
amend
change.
that as well. All right, so when we get to that, we'll have to look at that. Okay, so we've got the motion before us related to the ordinance itself. Just to make sure staff, the council, and the attorney are all clear on what we're considering at this point.
I am.
Seems to be the case. Yes, all right. If there's any discussion on the motion, as the maker of the motion, Councilmember Groff?
No, no further
All right.
discussion.
Any discussion as the seconder?
I think we've had enough.
Okay. And I will just summarize by saying it appears that the changes we've made have actually expanded the period for signs in odd year elections beyond what was proposed prior to this evening.
Correct.
So that's probably a good thing. With that, we've got the motion before us to adopt that ordinance with those changes as discussed. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That passes unanimously, 3-0. And I would note, Mr. Trudgeon, that actually a ordinance summary requires a 2/3 vote of the members of the council or just the people present. Maybe that's a question for an attorney. Because I know ordinance summaries require a supermajority, but the question
do.
is,
A supermajority would be, I believe, 2/3 vote of the council, so I don't think you could have a supermajority.
so we couldn't do it this
Yeah.
evening. So we'll have to bring back the ordinance summary
Or we just print it.
or print the whole ordinance. Well, you know,
It's not too.
It's not that big.
it's a one-page ordinance.
Yeah,
Yeah, let's just,
Yeah,
okay,
Okay.
Okay, then we don't have to worry about the wording of that.
no summary.
Okay.
All right. Handled. All right.
Handled with
Handled.
details.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone. This next item, another ordinance on another topic, which is also related to legislative action. There's sort of a theme this evening. And I'll turn it over again to Mr. Trudgeon to introduce the topic of looking at adding a hotel licensing ordinance to our bag of tools as a city. Mr. Trudgeon.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As you mentioned, the legislature did pass a law allowing cities to directly license hotels without having to deal with the health authority or health implications, health code implications that was previously in the state law. And that's a big thank you to the Roseville City Council making it a priority and giving me instructions to go down and try to get that law changed. But I think the big difference maker was involving our Roseville Police Department. See Deputy Chief Joe Adams here. He testified several times down at the legislature along with Chief Scheider, talking about the challenges of criminal activity happening in hotels and really powerless to really make any effective change there. So this licensing will go a long way, as you mentioned, Mr. Mayor, give us another tool to help regulate the hotels here. And so we're really pleased that this law did pass. And so the next step for us to do is actually create an ordinance with a licensing framework around that, talking about the need, A, to get a license, but B, then what the expectations are to continue to operate and what our ability is to regulate that and in the worst cases, revoke a license and no longer allow them to be in business. So just to start off the discussion tonight, I included in the packet, and I think the council was aware of the City of Waite Parks ordinance. They had special legislation several years ago to get exactly what we were trying to get. So we thought it was a good basis to at least begin some of the discussion about what our ordinance should look like. To date, I haven't had the city attorneys draft anything, but we want wanted to first check in with the council. I think generally speaking, I think the City of Wade Park's ordinance is a good model for us to use. We'd have to tweak it along the way to represent some of the things we do already in place about a repeat nuisance, and there may be some ways we want to approach it differently. So I want to open that up for that particular discussion. And I do know the City of Wade Park has revoked at least one hotel license, so it can be done. We can, I'm not sure I'll go line by line through the ordinance. I did list on the screen here some things that were contained in there. Definitions, the mayor asked an interesting question today about lodging establishments. It's defined a couple different ways, hotels and other things, so I think we won't get our hands around that. I do know lodging establishments is the term used in state statutes quite often to have the broad umbrella of hotels, motels, inns, things like that. Some of the other things that they did was just require the basics, a city issue license to operate a lodging establishment and how you apply for that. Reasons for a denial of a original license in the first place. Then also talking about a little bit further down about a revocation of a license. The fact that the license is in that person's name and not something that can be transferred from person to person. So if somebody were to buy it, for instance, they would need to apply for a license. We'd need to do our background checks and everything else, make sure that it was proper. And some other nuts and bolts things about, using an investigative report to really outline what the challenges are, the problems there are. So as you consider taking action as a city council, you have stated written findings of fact, almost to speak, to refer to and to utilize. And then about provision of notices, about how you notice the hotels when they're reaching certain thresholds, and it's kind of in the Wade Park ordinance, and similar to a repeat nuisance, is kind of the 3 strikes and you're out. We notify you along the way of the first violation, the second violation, and the third violation. There's some more drastic action. So this is like thresholds. After a certain amount of calls, we may reach out to you and say you're past this threshold. Continue to work with us, or there'll be other things happening down the line. So that's something we'll want to do. And as I said, under the repeat nuisance ordinance, we kind of have that scheme already laid out. I think we need to probably modify a little bit here, but I think we can do something very similar to that. And then also the ability, and this is pretty important because we talk about a lot of cumulative effects over a period of time, which is important, but there might be a singular event that is really bad, that is just unacceptable, that we want to shut it down just on that one particular event. So we want to make sure there's a language in there regarding that. And then some nuts and bolts, again, notice requirements for the hearing and revocation. They certainly have the ability to come forward and state their case and why maybe it shouldn't be revoked. And I thought this was interesting that under the Wade Park ordinance, the lodging establishments, after the revocation, would need to cease operations 15 days after that decision. That certainly allows some transition if there are some guests staying, obviously, to transition out. I think we always struggled with that a little bit with apartment buildings, for instance. When there's problems in an apartment building, it's not necessarily the tenant's fault, and we didn't necessarily want to put them on the street. And so we wanted to keep them there while maybe repairs were being fixed. But as this is more of a business operation and something that is transitory in the sense that people are there typically for a day or two, that we think having some period where it's a drop dead date, you can't continue to operate, but allow for some transition is fair for everybody involved. And then talking about reissuance of a license, what the procedure is for that, and minimum standards of operations, maintain a register of guests boarding their establishment. That it goes a long way in really helping us work if there's criminal activity there, to understand who's coming and going and making sure that they know who's coming and going. And then obviously this maybe goes without saying, but requiring an owner or operator to cooperate with law enforcement during a response to calls. We would certainly hope they would all do that, but I think our experience tells us that doesn't always happen. So this is kind of just a duty for them to do that. So that's kind of the real rough outline on that. Certainly be happy to answer any questions or entertain other ways to do that. The one thing I do want to ask, I think there should be some engagement with the hotel community as part of this. And just wondering maybe what the council will be looking for. As you know, I serve on the Visit Roseville board. I've been talking about this for years. The mayor was many years, and Councilmember Groff is on there too. So it's a topic that comes up quite frequently. But to have some direct interaction with the hotels, we have, 12 hotels. As we know, we're really focusing on a couple problem properties. But this would cover all the hotels. We want to make sure that they're informed and aware of it. If they have questions or concerns, we want to be able to address them as we move forward, and if necessary, incorporate them into the final ordinance. So certainly looking for feedback from the council on that. So with that, I'll pause and be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Trudgeon, and thanks to everyone in their work to get that legislation passed at the legislature. We really do appreciate that, and are appreciative of the opportunity to have another tool to be able to enforce standards on public accommodation in Roseville. So questions from the council for staff or thoughts?
Well,
Councilmember
I
Groff.
could begin, I guess the thoughts are, I'm pleased that we're having this because obviously we have struggled with this for years in Roseville, and maybe it'll help us solve some of the problems we've had. I did have a question about the revocation, and I think I know the answer now, because I was reading through that. Initially, I thought it goes to the city administrator, but it does go through you and then to the council, is that?
That's correct,
Okay.
yeah. That's how we would
So
want
that
that.
is the way that would work. At first I thought, oh, that might be a little bit much to put on just one person, because I wouldn't want this to set up a law that could be abused in some way. Oh, the other thing I had a question on was then there were a number of calls that triggers a response. And what if there's a person that just has it out for somebody and they call on that property? How do we handle that?
Yeah, the same question.
Yeah, so I think a couple ways. One, it'd have to be a kind of a verified call.
Yeah.
It's something that actually have to be happening, right? So it wouldn't just be, well, we got 3 calls today about this hotel. And I would note, under the repeat nuisance ordinance, we use a threshold of 10 calls per month. And maybe not all of you were here when we were initially having a conversation. We looked at our calls over years, and there was a clear break in hotels that had more than 10 calls a month or more versus less. And so that seemed to be a very valid threshold as we looked at our data, that hotels that had more than 10 calls really were extraordinarily busy compared to the other hotels. So that was the metric that we used. But we do take out any medical calls,
right.
domestic abuse calls,
Okay.
things like that. What we don't want is people not calling us.
Exactly.
Although I think it's a good point for us to keep the eye on the ball to make sure that we're really narrowing in on what is counting, so there's not this back and forth every time. Well, you guys showed up, but the guy was gone already, so there was no crime. But we still went out there, so still tying our folks up. And where do we draw that line? I don't know if I have a direct answer tonight, but I think that's something we continue to refine with. And I know currently with the hotels, we print off a list of all our calls, and we start striking out ones that don't apply. And even though there's still a lot of activity there, some of it's exempt or some of it's not been founded, so it's often hard to even get to that 10 calls in some months. But that's something we should pay attention to for sure.
I think that's all I had.
Okay. Other questions or thoughts? Councilmember Schroeder?
Councilmember Groff, and was one of the questions I had, that they would be verified nuisance calls. And then on that line, you talked about the one serious nuisance. I assume we need to define what those would be as well, because this, which warrants that.
The immediate action one?
Yes, the immediate action ones, we'd want to define that a bit. And then, it talked about when we were inspecting the premises in this ordinance, it said that we give them 72 hours prior to the inspection. Why is that?
Well, I think that's probably optional. We do provide notice on our regular inspections when we're coming. We do that for all our businesses, if nothing else, to make sure the right person's there when we need to be there to walk through. I don't know how often we do it, but I think sometimes we do pop out there, especially if we get a complaint, we
Right.
head out there. But just as a part of a regular inspection, we usually schedule that with the person.
But it doesn't stop you from looking around if you're out there for a call as well then?
Right, I mean, oftentimes there will be, if we're out there and if, say, police out there or fire's out there for something and notice some really abhorrent conditions, then they'll call code enforcement or the county, depending on who, to do some follow-up.
Okay.
For sure, yeah.
Okay, thank
But
you.
the 72 hours is probably something we have some discretion in.
I think, oh yeah, absolutely,
that.
yeah.
So this is Wake Park's
Right,
ordinance.
right,
and
that's
that
why I
may
was
be the
asking
thing.
about if there was a magic for the 72.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Okay,
I think one of the things that as I was thinking about sort of their 3 steps, or first notice, second notice, and third notice, it may make sense for us to simplify this by taking that back to our existing repeat nuisance call ordinance and simply say, because we have a 10-day period, right? And it's, or, excuse me, a 30-day period,
Yeah.
10 nuisance calls, and that triggers the fee. So you could have your first notice be the first time that happens.
Yep,
yep,
Your second notice is the second time it happens within so many months. And then your third notice is the third time within so many months. And, I don't know what the look back would be in each of those, but I mean, we could figure that out. And then I like the ability to have that immediate action still as something that can be done if there's, and it is still appealable. I think that's an important part of it. So even if there was an immediate action, undertaken, first of all, I imagine they would still have the 15 days, not to mention, perhaps an appeal period. I didn't read all the details on that, but I think that, so it wouldn't be unreasonable to have that and define it, as clearly as we can, but I think we also want to give ourselves the
keep
discretion
it broader. Yeah.
to be able to apply it to things we don't know yet that are going to come up.
Yeah.
So we always want that, I think, as an option. But I think those other steps, rather than their 15 calls and things like that, I think the nuisance call thing works. I've talked about this before with relation to that ordinance. I think we want to think about how we take into account code violations and put that into the equation, as well as health code violations that the county notes or cites for. Right, because we don't inspect those things, we don't regulate those things, but I think we do want to include that in our criteria for looking at whether we consider revocation of a license or the other steps for the first or second notice. I think that those are important things to take into account, so I just want to note that. And I already mentioned the appeal. I think they've got that set up pretty well. I think as I read their language about the lodging establishment, they have a very specific long section about buildings that are used within a distance from a hospital or medical center, used for families, for sleeping accommodations for patients and their caregivers while they're receiving or waiting to receive treatments. I almost just want to, unless that's something that has to be a part of it as a result of state law, I would say that doesn't seem to even apply to Roseville. And it's long and complicated, and if we don't need it, we should seriously consider taking it out. But once again, if there is something that's not right, we want to keep it in if it's appropriate. Then on the transferability part, I think I agree that we want to make sure that they can't just continue to pass the license along. But I do note that we have some language in our liquor license statutes that we put in about transfer requiring council approval. And just from the point of view of, not statute, ordinance, just from the point of view of consistency within our own code, we might want to look at that language as opposed to the Wake Park language, or some hybrid of the two, just to try to be consistent internally in our own thing. But I think it is important to keep that in there.
and if I could, Mr. Mayor, I think we would want to treat that as a new license. That would have to go through
Right.
the process of approval.
Which
by
is
city
essentially
council.
what they say.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's a good starting point. And once again, with some of those adjustments for our existing nuisance ordinance, I think that can be a good basis. And then some of the tweaks we've talked about this evening, I think that can be a good starting point. I did want to get into the topic. They, under their minimum standards for operations in section 105.3 on page 105-6, they had the A and B talking about requiring their tenants, occupants, to sign a register and verify their identity. And I know we had a discussion about that in relation to our regulation of single-family rentals, short-term rentals, and not necessarily being able to require that, and so a lot of angst associated with that. So I was curious to see that in this language, related to hotels, motels, and lodging establishments. And so I just wanted to point it out as something I'd like to hear more about from our attorney and how it relates to our discussion we had as to why we weren't requiring it for single-family short-term rentals. Because once again, try to be consistent.
Right, right. And I don't have a direct answer. I know it's probably more standard practice for hotels to do this traditionally anyway, but that's probably not a great answer. And what's the difference between short-term rentals and if there's any legal concerns?
Right,
So
right.
we
It
can-
seemed to be it was tied to some legal thing, but I can't remember what it was specifically. But I since we had that conversation and I saw this in here, I did want to ask that question.
Well, I thought it was you could ask for it, but they didn't have to give it to you, and then you had to get a court order to get it.
And I think you're right in that regard. And so,
The register itself.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
yeah. So I'm just curious about that language, even in the Wake Park ordinance, if it's enforceable for them. If it is, then maybe we do want to have it. But
Exactly.
then we just
Yeah.
want to understand what the issues are there, and
Well,
so
and then we could add it to the short term.
potentially, yeah. Yeah.
But it would be worth asking for it, even if they don't give it, because most people are probably going to give it.
Well, yeah, I mean, this talks about them requiring to keep the record of it. And then I'd have to look and see what they say about providing
Yeah.
that when asked by the city or anything like that. I didn't
If they
look too closely at
refuse.
that, but I mean, so let's make sure that topic is covered as part of this coming back. Anything else from the council's perspective?
And I assume you want us to do some engagement with the
Oh,
developers.
yes,
Oh,
for
yes.
sure, for sure. And I think the challenge is with only maybe 1, 2, or maybe 3 of the hotels being engaged in the board of the Visit Roseville, that wouldn't be enough, I think. But as to how it would happen, whether that's like an invitation to a gathering of all the hotel owners here at City Hall or at some other place, or something that Visit Roseville puts together and sets up. I think perhaps having one opportunity for everybody to come and participate, and still be able to provide written testimony as well, or whatever, and any kind of hearing we have at the council level as well.
Yeah,
But I think the outreach ahead of time makes sense, some kind of meeting or gathering to have a discussion, and here's the bullet points that we're looking at doing, and getting a response back.
Yeah, when we did I think when we were considering the 21 age restriction for tobacco, we reached out to all the tobacco license holders, held a meeting in this room. About half of them showed up. We also sent out written information too, and had conversations from that, and that was helpful. Just keep them informed and making sure that we're, obviously, there's always concern about regulation, right? But, is there a happy medium, and at least give them some understanding of what and why we're doing things, and it's always been a good dialogue, so we'll look to do something similar.
In the state law, is there a limitation as to when our ordinance or licensing scheme could go into effect, or is it as soon as we can enact it?
We have to enact it,
Right.
but it's not a time frame by a certain point
Okay,
of the year.
it's not like we can't do anything before January 1st of
No.
2024 or anything like
No,
that.
it takes
Since
effect
the
once
new
we're
law
ready.
went into effect July 1 of 2023.
Right, no, I understand that,
Yeah.
and certainly we had to take a step on our part to pass a resolution
Right.
back to the Secretary of State and saying that we acknowledged it in order to be able to do this step, so I do remember doing that. But yeah, I just wanted to make sure if there was.
That was for the sales.
But
tax,
I think we do want to give as we go towards enactment of something like this, I do think we want to talk to the hotel owners if they feel it's appropriate. I mean, I don't want to just give them like another 18 months before we put something into effect. I don't know that that's necessarily reasonable, but if there is something, if they have an argument to say, gosh, we're going to need 6 months or something like that, or whatever it might be, I'm not trying to suggest something here, but, that we don't just say, oh, it's going to go into effect, a week after our meeting with them, or the next
Yeah.
council meeting after our meeting with them. I think we want to not give them, as the owners and the people potentially under this ordinance, the sense that this is being rushed, or that they don't have a lot of time to make sure they have their voice heard. And so I would definitely want to make sure that that is communicated well to those folks,
Right.
and that adequate time is built into the process for them to feel.
So
that.
does their license they have now stay in effect until we do something?
They don't have a license from
So
us.
there are no licenses?
They have, do they have a license from the county, a health
Right, but
and
is
safety
that-
license?
But, so that's still in effect?
And that would be in effect regardless of
Yeah,
this.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah, so that's,
okay.
it'd be a layered, we'd have
Okay,
one.
that's
the
what I
county
was
would have one.
wondering, it's
Yeah.
a layered thing,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, and to your point, Mr. Mayor, I certainly want to have enough time to wrap up. I think conceptually all along, I've been thinking this summer that we'd start sometime January 1st and have an annual, but if that's not the appropriate time for whatever reason, we can
No, I think
adjust.
that could be very reasonable, but I just want to make sure we weren't trying to,
Yeah.
get this done in the next 30 days
No,
or something.
no.
Yeah.
No, we won't be ready for
I
that.
mean, not that I would be opposed to that
Yeah.
necessarily from an enforcement point of view, but I also understand and respect the owner's perspective and want to make sure that we're, not putting something into effect that's going to have too much impact too quickly and they don't have a chance to adapt or have the proper input. Okay. Anything else from the council on this? All right. Very good. So this will be coming back to the council at an appropriate time.
Yep, correct.
All right, based on the guidance and feedback we provided this evening. And I would note that certainly absent council members have the opportunity to provide feedback through Pat to the staff and as part of the process, or ask questions and get those answers. And if we can just make sure and kind of keep the clearinghouse of that back out to the rest of the council if there are issues that have come up since this conversation that I think might be of interest to all of us, that Pat makes sure and kind of keeps us in the loop. All right. That then brings us to our consideration of city council and EDA minutes. We've got a set of minutes from the EDA meeting of the 17th, as well as from the council meeting of the 17th of July. Changes and corrections were noted and provided to the council ahead of time. Are there any additional changes or corrections or a motion to approve one or both of those?
I would move to approve with the changes.
Second.
All right, it's been moved by Councilmember Schroeder, second by Councilmember Groff, to approve both sets of minutes as presented. Any discussion on that motion?
No?
All right, all those in favor of approving those sets of minutes signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That passes unanimously 3-0. Those minutes are approved. And that brings us then to our consent agenda. Mr. Trudgeon, if you can introduce those items for us.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Item 10A approves payments in the amount of $898,040.56. Item 10B, was already approved previously. We removed that from the consent agenda. Item 10C receives the second quarter financial report. Item 10D approves a resolution approving the final plat and development agreement for the Danny Boy Estates residential subdivision at 2560 Fry Street. Agenda item 10E approves the issuance of a premise permit for the Minnesota Fast Pitch Academy Foundation to conduct lawful gambling activities at Bent Brew Distillery at 1744 Terrace Drive. And item 10F approves a grant agreement with Ramsey County to receive 7 benches to be put along the Lexington and Wood Hill corridors for pedestrians to use. The city will install the benches at city cost, and that is the consent agenda.
All right, thank you, Mr. Trudgeon. Is there a motion on the consent agenda with the exception of 10B?
So moved.
Second?
All right, it's been moved by Councilmember Groff, second by Councilmember Schroeder. Discussion on that motion?
No.
I would just note the second quarter financial report did not indicate any signs of issues, and so that's a good thing, and that's why we appreciate getting those updates. So thanks again to staff for putting that together. With that, we've got the motion before us to approve consent items A, C, D, E, and F. If there's no further discussion, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That passes unanimously. Those items are approved, received, or accepted. That then brings us to future agenda review, councilmember reports, communications, and announcements. And we'll start with City Manager Trudgeon once again to go through upcoming meeting agendas.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a reminder, there's no council meeting next Monday, but our next meeting will be the 21st. And we'll have the Hispanic Heritage Month proclamation. We'll also have representatives of the League of Minnesota Cities to present our award. Also hear from me some more about the preliminary budget and levy, make a presentation on that. We do want to have a couple conversations around a reasonable accommodation ordinance for our zoning code, and then begin discussion of the Sacred Settlement zoning code changes. We're all very familiar with that state law. On the 24th, a few days later, we'll be having commission applicant interviews. I know we have some applications, but we could use more. It goes to the 15th, so we have openings on the HRIC, and Public Works, Environment, and Transportation Commissions.
And what does HRIEC stand for, Mr.?
Human Rights, Inclusion, and Engagement Commission. Yes, thank you. So after that, our next meeting will be September 11th. And as of now, we don't have a lot on. I suspect it will fill up. But right now, we do know we'll have MnDOT here talking about Highway 36 and the future plans for that. On the 18th, we'll have kind of two types of meetings. One will be the EDA. The EDA meeting should be fairly short. It'll be the EDA budget. So the council acting as the EDA does need to make a recommendation to the council for the EDA budget and levy. So that's what you'll formally do, and you saw that previously. Then on the 18th, we'll have the Finance Commission come with their recommendation on the budget. I will be meeting with them here in August after our meeting to present the budget to them, so they'll have some more detail on that. We also expect, it's not listed there, but we hopefully will have an Envision Roseville update and kind of start the wrap-up of kind of where we're at and share the findings with all of you there. So at some point, too, we will have our classification and compensation study that could land in the 18th. It just depends. So stay tuned to that. But we'll have a pretty busy fall with several big items, budget notwithstanding. We'll have some other bigger items to deal with as well. So we'll bring this forward as they're ready to come. And that's the future agenda.
All right, thank you, Mr. Trudgeon. Questions on the future agenda, or council member reports, or announcements, or future agenda items suggested by council members? Councilmember Groff.
A quick reminder, I think on the Envision Roseville, August 16th at the Oval is the in-person 4 to 7. We're inviting all the public to come and give in their input. I think that's the last meeting, if I'm not wrong.
That's correct. You are correct.
And Night to Unite was great, and I took it out to several places and talked about that. And people are very interested. I'm hoping we get a good turnout.
Excellent. All right.
If
Any
I
other-
was out that Unite Tonight too, hit a bunch of places. It was amazing how many there were in Roseville.
Yes, I couldn't get.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, what was the number? I
It was
didn't-
over 80 for sure.
Oh, no,
80,
no, yeah, I did.
80 to
That's
85.
Made it to
a
9.
robust number.
It is, yes.
Yeah, yeah, 9 is a good number
And
to
some
get
of
to.
them had a lot of people. I think I went to one where there were about 50, 60 people.
I have to apologize to my own neighborhood for not being at the meeting because I was out of town at that time.
Sometimes it happens.
So these things do happen, but I know I saw the pictures and there were a lot of people there too. So great.
Just one more
Oh,
thing.
yeah.
And then the Rice Street Gardens had their event on Saturday, and it
Thank
was
you.
really a really nice event. And they had several vendors out, and they had music, and you got to hear a little bit about the plans for what they're doing, trying to get some housing there and maintain the gardens and raising money. So that was a good community event.
And 1 week from that, which is this coming Saturday, is the Rice Larpenteur Alliance Summer Block Party on the corner of Rice and Larpenteur. There'll be blues and jazz music in the from say 11 or 12ish to I think 3 or so is when it ends. But it's gonna come when you can, and there's food vendors and there's activities for young people and old people alike, and everybody in between. And it's the 4th year, I believe, of that block party.
Yeah.
It's been amazing every year, and looking forward to it. It looks like the weather's going to be fantastic, so encourage everybody to get out for that. You don't need to be from the Rice and Larpenteur neighborhood to attend. I think I'm barely on the fringe of that, but do appreciate the opportunity to serve on that board, and I think the events that they do are just tremendous for building that community between Maplewood, Roseville, and St. Paul, and really treating it like one community instead of 3 separate cities.
Yep, in the county.
It's been crazy. It's been amazing. I shouldn't say crazy. It's been amazing. All right. With that, then, if there's no further announcements, communications, reports, or future agenda items, the only thing left on our agenda is a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved by Councilmember Schroeder,
We're
second by
taking turns.
Councilmember Groff. I'll have to double check if you alternated every time, but.
We were trying.
All right. There is no discussion on a motion to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That passes unanimously 3-0. We are adjourned at 7:33. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.